Hey, welcome to 12 Tone. 52 years ago this month, the Jimi Hendrix Experience released their debut album, Are You Experienced, in the UK. Hendrix is probably one of the most important figures in the entire history of the electric guitar, so today I wanted to take a look at a song that really exemplifies his mastery of the instrument, Purple Haze. Let's do it. Tritones. So if we look at just the bass part, it's playing low and high E's, and if we look at just the guitar, it's playing low and high B flats. On their own, either of these lines would sound perfectly pleasant. After all, they're just playing octaves, the most consonant interval. But when we take both parts together, the distance between those two octave lines is a tritone, one of the most dissonant intervals. Now, normally when we see tritones, we expect resolution. This wants to resolve to this. But instead of giving us that, they just keep jumping back and forth between low and high versions of that same tritone, denying us any clear sense of grounding. This makes them what's called non-functional tritones, where their sense of directionality is subverted and they're instead used just to create dissonance. This makes the intro feel really disorienting. It keeps implying a resolution, but it never actually gives you one. Eventually, though, that dissonance settles down a bit with this riff. Let's start with the bass. It's playing the exact same line as before with low and high E's. This makes it what's called a pedal, where one instrument holds down a single note even while the rest of the music changes, and it helps provide some stability. Now that the B flats are gone, this establishes that we're definitely in the key of E, which in turn helps us properly contextualize the guitar part. Speaking of which, this guitar part is broken up into two 4-note phrases. This one, and this one. If we take the first three notes of each, they're both outlining the same chord, E minor 7, the 1 chord. Well, technically this first phrase is outlining G major, but that's just what you get when you play E minor 7 without the root, and since the bass is hammering out E's, I think it's fair to read these both as the same chord. The first real difference comes at the ends of the phrases. The first one ends on A, while the second ends on E. This makes it a very short example of what's called a period, which is a melodic structure where the first phrase, or antecedent, ends on an unstable point, while the second phrase, the consequent, ends on a resolution. A is the fourth note of the key, generally considered one of the least stable because of its desire to fall down to the third, while E is the root, which makes it a very solid landing point. The other main difference between these phrases is their direction. They both start in roughly the same register, but the first one shoots way up high, while the second one falls down to the very bottom of the guitar's range. In total, we span over 2 octaves in just 8 notes, and this juxtaposition again helps sell the period structure. Running upward tends to build energy, while falling down releases it. It's a great piece of melody. Anyway, they play that twice, then we get this, which is a pretty simple variation of the original riff. We have the same upward-downward thing going on, but there's a couple important differences. First, the walk-up doesn't go nearly as high. It tops out around B, which is where the original one started. This helps calm the music down a bit, giving you a chance to breathe in between all the high notes. It's still creating some lift, but it's not as dramatic. The other difference is at the ends of the phrases. Instead of A, the first one ends on G, and instead of E, the second one ends on a different G. This is really interesting to me because of how it plays with your expectations. In the first phrase, the G is replacing the fourth, and as we mentioned earlier, the fourth is unstable because it wants to resolve to the third. This means that putting a G here instead releases a lot of tension, making the phrase feel much more resolved. On the other hand, in the second line, it replaces E, and while the third is a reasonably solid note, it can't compete with a root, so here it winds up feeling less resolved, implying further motion. The exact same note is creating two very different effects based on where in the riff you put it. Then finally we get this, which is another variation of the line we just heard. It starts the same, but instead of ending on G, it goes back to A, then we jump the gun, starting the descending line a beat early with this G to D motion that usually starts the second phrase before turning around and walking up to a high E, wrapping up the riff nicely. It's a good, strong resolution, but instead of letting us rest, we get this little, almost arrhythmic fill back down to a low E, because the song doesn't stop here. Before we get to the verse though, there's one last thing I want to address in this intro. The drums. They're playing something like this, And if you can't read drum notation, don't worry, the important point is that there's a snare on every single beat. Traditionally, rock drummers use the snare for what's called the backbeat, which means playing it on beats 2 and 4. This helps define the structure of the bar, effectively providing a roadmap for the song's rhythm. Playing the snare on every beat, then, could be viewed as an attempt to hide that structure, making it harder to map what you're hearing onto a clear rhythmic hierarchy. This would allow the performers to experiment more with things like rhythmic displacement, but if that's the goal, then it's not really being taken advantage of. The guitar part follows the bar structure pretty rigidly, and the bass is even emphasizing the backbeat with its high E's, so we're not really losing that rhythm. Instead, what I think this is for is just more disorientation. Much like the non-functional tritones in the intro, this can be viewed as a sort of non-functional snare drum. It's taking away the snare's power to direct us through the structure of the bar. We're still getting that rhythmic information, it's just harder to find because it's not coming from where we're expecting it. Anyway, let's get to the verse. Compared to what we just saw, this is pretty straightforward. It's just these two bars over and over. But just because it's short doesn't mean it's easy, so let's get into what they're playing. We start with this, which Hendrix used so much that guitarists have nicknamed it the Hendrix chord. At its heart, it's an E chord, which makes it the 1, but instead of being major or minor, it's a dominant 7th. This is pretty common in blues-influenced music. A major 7 would be too bright, a minor 7th too consonant, but a dominant 7th? That's just right. It gives the chord a sort of edginess, making even the root feel dissonant. It's also another subversion of function. Dominant 7ths contain tritones, so they traditionally want to resolve, but in the blues, they're mainly just used for their bite. And Hendrix leans into that bite by adding another dissonant note on top. It's either a G natural or an F double sharp, depending on how much of a note name purist you are, and in the context of the chord, it's what's called the sharp 9. The 9 is just a fancy name for the note that sits a whole step above the octave, and the sharp 9 is just that, but another half step higher. This means it sits directly below the major 3rd, or in this case, a major 7th above it, creating an additional layer of dissonance that really helps destabilize the 1 chord. From there, we go to flat 3, then the 4 chord. The flat 3 chord is an ambiguous one that can do a couple different jobs, but here I think it's just serving as an approach chord to set up the actual star, the 4, which then resolves back to 1. The interesting thing here, though, is that the 4 chord is major. There's a couple ways to interpret this, but given how clearly the song is influenced by the blues, I'm gonna go for a blues-based explanation. In that style, it's not uncommon to use major chords even when you're implying a minor tonality. After all, major triads are just baby dominant 7ths, and the blues loves dominant 7ths. Eventually, that feeds into what's called a rhythm stop, where the band drops out and leaves the vocals to sing all alone. This is the "Excuse Me While I Kiss the Sky" part, and once he's done singing, we get one of the most iconic riffs ever played. And for something so great, it's actually pretty simple. We start by walking past the root, beginning on the 2nd and ending on the flat 7th. Hitting the notes on either side helps establish that root without actually resolving to it, so we keep our forward momentum. After that, we get this line twice, which you may recognize as the first 3 notes of the intro riff. Seriously, the only difference is he hangs on this high G instead of dropping back down to an A. Reusing musical material from earlier in the song helps tie the whole thing together because your ears already know what to expect from this melody. The riff is also interesting rhythmically. It starts on beat 3, but because the rhythm section dropped out, it's easy to miss that, and if you view this note as beat 1, then it feels like the riff ends in the middle of the bar, again playing into that disorientation theme. This is exacerbated by the fact that the whole section is 3 bars long, whereas most of the other parts in this song come in groups of 2, so the rhythm actually is off here, just in a different way. That feeds back into another verse, and we run through all that again, and then finally we end up in the solo. I'm not going to talk too much about the guitar solo itself here. Many people already have. Instead, I want to focus on something that gets talked about a lot less, the accompaniment he's soloing over. Now, the Jimi Hendrix experience is a trio, and the drums don't really affect the harmony, which means we're mostly going to be looking at the bass. That's what's creating the backdrop on top of which Hendrix is doing his improvising, and it's actually a pretty cool part. After the interlude, the bass drops down for a bar of A, then B, then D, then finally this, which it loops for the rest of the solo. Now, first things first, remember how I said the end of the interlude was just the beginning of the intro, but without going down to the A? Well, here the bass completes that move, again tying us back into musical elements we're already familiar with. A is, again, a fairly unstable note in the key, so going here instead of back to the 1 chord like we did after the first interlude tells us that the song is moving in a different direction. From there, we start walking up the scale back to the root, first hitting the 5, then the flat 7. If you're wondering why we skipped the flat 6, it's because the scale we're walking up isn't actually minor. It's minor pentatonic. This is a slightly simplified version of the minor scale, which removes a couple of the thornier notes, and it's very common in rock and blues music. Losing the flat 6 means we only have 3 bars in our walk-up though, and again we're expecting groups of 2, so when we get to the main body of the solo, it feels like it's starting before we're ready. You can probably guess what effect that has. Speaking of which, that body is just played over this loop, where we start on the root for a bar, then get 2 beats each of the note above it and the note below it. This technique of playing the notes on either side of the root to set up a return is called encircling, and while we could probably analyze the harmonic functions of the implied chords, honestly it mostly just works because they're all right next to each other. It's like you're marking out your target so everyone knows when you hit it. It just feels good, like a big slow trill. This also calls back to that riff from the interlude, which starts with a 2 going to flat 7. Again, reusing musical material makes your song feel more cohesive. And that's pretty much it. After that we get the intro again, although he develops the lines slightly differently, and then we get another verse followed by another solo, which is actually mostly just Hendrix holding a single high note for a really long time, which makes it feel like we're not actually going anywhere, like the music has become lost until it just sort of fades out, which, given how disorienting this whole song is a pretty appropriate way to end it. Anyway, thanks for watching. This song was chosen by my patrons over on Patreon, so if you want to help pick the next song we analyze, just head on over to Patreon and pledge at any level. You can also join our mailing list to find out about new episodes, like, share, comment, subscribe, and above all, keep on rockin'.